Let's take a look at a historical context of gender. Employment patterns have been greatly influenced by the intersectionality of gender and ethnicity. What is often imagined today to be traditional actually represents only a small slice of middle and upper class white families in Western countries in the 19th and early 20th century. After the Industrial Revolution, work moved out of the home into factories and offices. Men worked apart from their families, and it seemed wives should take over responsibilities at home and provide a domestic haven for their husbands. The literature on gender and work is very extensive, crosses several fields of study, and can only be sampled here as we try to understand gender as a dimension of diversity and inclusion at work. Two basic conceptual distinctions are whether sexes should be seen as fundamentally different or the same in work related attributes, and separation of public work and private, home, and non work life activities. Researchers study how the labor market creates and maintains sex segregation and differences in outcome. For years, researchers have tried to separate gender stereotypes from objectively verifiable differences. This distinction is surprisingly difficult, partly because the measures themselves are easily affected by gendered expectations. For example, evaluations of infants' behavior are affected more by what they think is the infant's sex. In the 1980s, psychologists began using meta analysis to draw overall conclusions from the large body of sex difference research. They studied cognitive abilities, often assessed in hiring and promotion, that are not easily altered by applicants. Overall, results showed that meta-analytic comparisons of sex differences yield small or no differences more often than are often found in other areas of psychology. What does this mean for diversity and inclusion professionals? In an employment setting, the behavior and ability of an individual should be considered, not stereotypic expectations based on sex. In hiring decisions, one should avoid using predictors known to produce significant differences between sexes because this could be interpreted as adverse impact. In general, predictors should only be used if shown to be valid for the job in question. Validity information is essential for measures that show adverse impact. When in doubt, seek other measures that do not have adverse impact. Even empirically reliable sex differences seem small in comparison with differences in occupations, pay, benefits, employment settings, positions in upper and top management, and election to public office. It seems unlikely that differences in these tangible employment outcomes can be justified by measurable differences in abilities between the sexes. Other factors must be important as well. Sex discrimination is differential treatment based on sex, whether intentional or not. In a work environment, the term sex discrimination usually applies to employment decisions with negative consequences for the target, like unfair denial of employment, lower pay, or lack of access to training or promotion. In employment, sex discrimination is rooted in culturally influenced behavior, including stereotypes and beliefs about the status of women and men, as well as in institutional factors like structures and practices of organizations. Organizations attempt to reduce gender based inequities by holding people accountable for decisions and using formal procedures that limit subjectivity. Similar changes should also reduce discrimination based on other factors. People often disagree about whether a particular action constitutes inappropriate sex discrimination. The reason for differential treatment is not always clear, especially when there are many possible explanations in addition to sex. Unlike other forms of discrimination, such as those based on ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, sex discrimination does not stem from a lack of contact or information about outgroup members. Sexism refers to prejudicial attitudes based on sex, in a context of power and advantage, privileging men. Thus, sexism rests on an underlying assumption that women's status is inferior to men's. Sexist attitudes can be directed at men or at women. However, given the male oriented power imbalance in most organizations, sexism directed at women is probably more common and more likely to cause distress. If sexist attitudes about women were always negative, then they might be easy to identify. However, sexism is complex and often involves both hostility and benevolence towards women. Old fashioned sexism consists of agreement with traditional gender roles, stereotypes that women are less competent, and different treatment of the two sexes. Modern sexism denies the existence of sex discrimination and reacts negatively to demands for equality. Federal laws addressing sex discrimination are the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Also relevant is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, a Title VII amendment clarifying that discrimination based on pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions is a form of sex discrimination. Sexual harassment has also been interpreted by the Supreme Court as a type of sex discrimination actionable under Title VII. About one-third of EEOC charges each year allege sex discrimination of some type. Although laws and regulations have been effective in some cases in addressing sex discrimination, gender inequities remain in part due to the limitations of current law and enforcement strategy. Despite successes of the EPA and Title VII in addressing some cases of sex discrimination, their effect is limited by the requirement that sex-based differences can only be challenged when jobs are the same or substantially equal in content. The PDA requires pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical incapacitation to be treated as other temporary disabling conditions. Adverse employment actions based on pregnancy are considered sex discrimination. Diversity professionals should be well informed about sexual harassment and the range of possible responses by victims and by organizations. Employers should have a comprehensive policy concerning sexual harassment and handling complaints. However, for diversity professionals, it's also important to consider effects on victims of discrimination and harassment that contradict inclusion in positive working conditions and may lead to performance or attendance problems. The lack of fit model predicts that gender discrimination will be most likely when the incumbent sex does not fit this job stereotype based on sex of most incumbents and the nature of job tasks. Organizational culture and processes must also change to support all employees, regardless of demographic difference. Self-silencing is reacting to sexist events by not speaking out or reacting in other overt ways, consistent with prescriptive gender roles for women, including conflict avoidance and prioritizing others' needs before one's own. Situations differ greatly in terms of seriousness and pervasiveness of discrimination, like whether it's potentially illegal, organizational policies, victims' resources, and his or her vulnerability and available alternatives. General recommendations cannot be made about the best strategy in a particular instance. Close relationships at work differ widely, but overall are probably more liberal now than many years ago. Effects on these policies should be monitored to assure that a pattern of institutional discrimination does not develop in which job assignments and career progressions of female or male employees are systematically harmed. Organizations vary greatly in restricting, allowing, or encouraging employment of friends and relatives. Diversity professionals should consider implications of such practices for discrimination against members of a protected category. Strict anti-nepotism policies more often restrict opportunities of women than of men. In job design, benefit structure, and institutionalized assumptions of many contemporary organizations, they assume a specific family structure. The hypothetical family includes a primary breadwinner who is the ideal worker, available on call 24/7 to respond to work demands and committed primarily to employer needs. An at-home spouse or partner is primarily responsible for the care of the home, children, and other dependents, and if employed, accommodates these commitments to the other's primary work. Parenthood is an important element of diversity and has different aspects on employed men and women. The concept of a good father does not conflict with the ideal worker. Although fathers are away from children while at work, being a good provider is part of the father's role. Studies generally show that fathers are more successful at work than non-fathers. Many organizations recognize diversity in family structures, and some accommodate needs of families. Concerns of the single adult with no dependents shouldn't be overlooked. Diversity professionals should work towards equitable employment arrangements. The major federal legislation dealing with work and family obligations is the FMLA. To be covered, employers must have 50 or more employees, and employees must be employed 12 or more months and more than 24 hours per week. Required family leave is not available to care for parents, in law, or unmarried partners. Most employers recognize the feeling of work life conflict, the stress experienced from trying to handle responsibilities at home and at work. Higher conflict levels are associated with lower satisfaction with work, life, or both. Sometimes one role provides resources, contacts, experiences, or skills that actually improve role performance in other areas. Time management or prioritization skills developed at home may be useful at work. These illustrate work life facilitation. Work family benefits can improve inclusion of employees with diverse family structures. These include flexible work hours, telecommuting, leaves for maternity or paternity of family needs, health insurance coverage, temporary reduction in hours, job sharing, and referrals about or access to child and elder care. Culture and supervisors can support informal adjustments for family responsibility. Gender and work life family issues are strongly linked. Families are diverse, with many employees responsible for elderly, disabled, or chronically ill family members. Some employees are parented and some are not. Children may have one parent or two, and some have same sex parents. Work life policies should be administered to convey that these policies are a response to family needs and aimed at everyone, regardless of sex, in the interest of reduced conflict and enhanced work performance. Work life policies are part of managing diversity and improving inclusion.